At first, the world barely noticed. A missed appearance here, a skipped event there, small absences that seemed ordinary, almost routine. But slowly a quiet, unspoken question began to take shape, one that no one inside the palace dared to confront. Prince Louis was gone. There were no school outings captured by the press, no cheerful waves from the palace balcony, no flickers of the mischievous energy that had once made the youngest royal so endearing. The youngest face of the modern monarchy seemed to slip quietly out of view, vanishing from public attention as if by design, almost unnoticed, almost normal. And yet for those paying close attention, that absence carried a weight no words could capture, a subtle, gnawing emptiness that hinted at something far more profound than a missed appearance, something almost imperceptible but undeniably felt by those who knew where to look. Only recently did the palace finally acknowledge Louis's absence, but their carefully measured statement explained almost nothing. Beneath the surface lay a story of silence, deliberate choices, and a family navigating emotional and logistical complexities far beyond what headlines could ever convey. This was not about speculation or idle rumor. This was about patterns, small, almost imperceptible shifts that, when seen together, told a story no one outside the palace was yet ready to hear. Once noticed, these patterns could not be unseen. They lingered in the corners of official photographs, in the gaps between smiling faces, in the fleeting gestures of those who carried the burden of keeping everything under control. For weeks, observers sensed something was amiss. At first, the reasoning seemed reasonable enough. Children retreat from public view all the time, families protect their privacy, a temporary pause can be entirely natural. But as official engagements passed one after another, one detail refused to be overlooked. Prince George appeared, Princess Charlotte appeared, and yet the space where Louis should have stood remained conspicuously empty. No statements, no passing references, not even a single photograph. The silence was heavy, deliberate, almost tangible, as if the air around the family itself had been carefully curated to shield him from view. Those attuned to the subtleties of royal life began to sense that this was no ordinary absence. It carried intention, a quiet firmness, a protective hand guiding what could and could not be shared. 3 key occasions made the absence impossible to dismiss: Commonwealth Day, Trooping the Colour, and Remembrance Sunday. Each time the Wales family presented a united front, but it was incomplete. To the trained eye, familiar with the subtle language of royal symbolism, Louis's absence was glaring, almost deafening. The monarchy communicates as much through presence as it does through words, and in his absence a silent message resonated. Something was different, something was being protected, and something significant was unfolding beyond public view. Was it simply parental discretion, a temporary adjustment, or a more profound, deliberate decision quietly taking shape behind palace walls? What unsettled observers most was not just that Louis was missing, it was how consistently, how deliberately, and how carefully he had been kept out of sight. Even for those not trained in royal protocol, the void was unnerving. Where once a small, lively figure would command attention, now there was space, almost an emptiness that drew the eye more than any presence ever could. It was as though the palace itself had paused, collectively holding its breath in a choreography of protection and control. Rumors could have swirled, questions could have been asked, yet silence reigned. And silence, in this case, was louder than any statement the palace could have issued. It spoke of concern, of vigilance, of a family willing to bend tradition quietly for the sake of one child. In hindsight, even the smallest gestures that day carried meaning. Every glance, every measured movement, every strategic placement of family members on the balcony was intentional. The absence was not an oversight. It was a signal, one that only those trained to read the subtle cues of monarchy could interpret. And the more one studied the patterns, the more it became clear, this was not simply about missing an event. This was about shielding, protecting, and prioritizing well-being in a world where every action was observed, recorded, and analyzed. Then came the palace statement, brief, measured, almost clinical in its detachment. 6 carefully chosen lines that referenced Louis's well-being and a period away from public duties. There was no drama, no explanation, no embellishment, only the barest acknowledgement. To the general public, it sounded reassuring, almost benign. But to those attuned to the subtle language of the monarchy, every word or lack thereof spoke volumes. Because when the palace says little, it is echoes, there is nothing to say. Timing matters, precision matters, and control above all matters. This was not a celebratory announcement of a return to normalcy. It was in essence a quiet acknowledgement that a shift had occurred, and that distinction, invisible to most, is crucial. History shows that when royal children retreat from public life, the reasons are rarely straightforward. The decisions are layered, the considerations countless, and the path back when it comes is seldom simple or direct. One detail, almost imperceptible at the time, would later take on extraordinary significance: Louis's final balcony appearance. To the casual observer, it seemed like any other ceremonial event: smiles, waves, tradition meticulously performed. But for those watching closely, something felt different. Louis, usually bright, playful, and instinctively lively, was quiet, restrained, almost withdrawn. His posture was rigid, his movements deliberate and careful, his eyes distant, scanning yet disengaged. This was not misbehavior, this was not playful rebellion. It was measured restraint, a young child holding himself in check in a world that demanded constant performance. Observers would later note subtle signs of emotional overwhelm, common in highly stimulating environments, yet striking when contrasted with the spontaneous energy he had displayed in the past. Catherine, poised, elegant, composed as ever, registered the moment instantly. Her gaze shifted subtly but meaningfully, not to the cheering crowd, not to the cameras, but to her son. In that fleeting glance, unnoticed by nearly everyone, lay a question that only a parent could ask without words. "Are you okay?" It lasted less than a second, yet in that second, volumes were communicated. Concern, care, awareness, and silent reassurance. William, equally composed, mirrored that attentiveness with his own subtle cues. A quick, discreet scan of the crowd, a barely perceptible nod to an aide nearby. These were gestures that seemed inconsequential at the time, yet in retrospect, they reveal a layer of orchestration, coordination, and deep familial vigilance that had gone entirely unseen by the public. Behind the scenes, the level of care extended even further. Photographers who covered the event later confirmed that explicit restrictions had been placed on capturing images of Louis. No close-ups, no isolated shots, no prolonged focus. Every lens was trained to avoid him. This was not censorship for its own sake, this was protective concern. It was an acknowledgement that certain aspects of his presence, his behavior, his reactions were private, fragile, and deserving of shelter from scrutiny. That quiet, protective framework shaped everything that followed. When the palace eventually spoke, it was not issuing a warning or announcing a crisis. It was confirming a decision that had been painstakingly formed, discussed, and deliberated behind closed doors. Such decisions are never spontaneous. They are built quietly, methodically, in private corridors where advisors, parents, and aides weigh every potential consequence. Each word, each gesture, each protocol is calculated to balance safety with duty, privacy with tradition. In the world of royalty, public absence is never accidental. It is deliberate, intentional, and meaningful, a decision that communicates without speaking. If you want, I can take the next section about Catherine and William's private efforts, the specialists' involvement, and the emotional weight on the family, and expand it in the same cinematic, emotionally rich style, turning it into a seamless, narrative-driven story. Do you want me to do that next? You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. Expand more. Absolutely, let's take your section and expand it further into a fully cinematic, deeply reflective narrative, adding layers of emotion, tension, and context while keeping the meaning precise. Here's the expanded version. Then came the palace statement, brief, measured, almost eerily impersonal. 6 lines at most, referencing only Louis's well-being and a period away from public duties. There was no drama, no sensational explanation, no attempt to elaborate or reassure beyond the most basic acknowledgement. To the public, it sounded neutral, almost comforting in its simplicity. But for those attuned to the subtle, almost coded language of the monarchy, every carefully chosen word or conspicuous absence of words spoke volumes. Because when the palace says very little, it is rarely because there is nothing to say. Timing matters, control matters, precision matters. In a world where every gesture is scrutinized, where every appearance is interpreted, even silence is deliberate, this was not a statement heralding a return. It was a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed, and that distinction, invisible to the casual observer, was profound. History shows that when royal children retreat from public life, the reasons are rarely simple, and the journey back is never linear. Among the subtleties that most overlooked was Louis's final balcony appearance. At first glance, it seemed like any other ceremonial event, coordinated smiles, precise waves, tradition executed perfectly. But for those paying attention, there was an unmistakable difference. Louis, usually a spark of spontaneity, animation, and natural charm, appeared contained, almost subdued. His movements were deliberate, measured, restrained, his posture rigid yet careful, his expression distant, even guarded. This was not misbehavior, this was not performance. This was restraint born from necessity, a child instinctively regulating himself in a world that demanded constant attention and composure. Observers later identified subtle signs of emotional strain, signs entirely consistent with the pressure of high-stimulus environments, yet stark when set against the uninhibited energy he had displayed in prior appearances. Catherine, ever poised, elegant, and composed, noticed immediately. Her gaze, for the briefest fraction of a second, left the crowd, left the cameras, and settled on her son. In that fleeting look, invisible to most, was a silent message, a question only a parent could ask without words. "Are you okay?" It was protective, quiet, and full of concern. A single second carried a lifetime of maternal vigilance. William, too, responded in his own understated way. A quick measured scan of the crowd, a barely perceptible nod to an aide, a micro-gesture that conveyed awareness and readiness. These small, almost invisible movements were not merely reactions, they were signals, subtle coordination to protect, to monitor, to ensure that even in the public gaze, Louis remained shielded from harm or undue attention. The measures went further than appearances. Photographers later revealed that strict restrictions had been placed on capturing images of Louis. No close-ups, no isolated shots, no prolonged focus. Every camera angle, every frame was carefully curated to protect him. This was not control for control's sake. This was protection, a silent, deliberate effort to shelter a child from exposure, from the constant scrutiny that accompanies public life. These restrictions, invisible to the public, shaped everything that followed. When the palace finally spoke, it was not announcing a problem. It was confirming a decision that had been meticulously formed in private, carefully weighed, debated, and deliberated behind closed doors. Such decisions do not appear overnight. They are the product of countless discussions, consultations, and considerations, weighing duty against well-being, tradition against humanity, visibility against privacy. Every gesture, every word, every omission is deliberate. In a monarchy where public absence is rare and heavily scrutinized, to step back is to communicate, whether you speak or not. This absence, more than any statement, was a declaration. Protection comes before performance, well-being comes before spectacle, and sometimes the most powerful statement is the one that makes no sound at all. In retrospect, the palace statement, though sparse, signaled a monumental shift. It revealed a parent's resolve, a family's deliberation, and an institution grappling with its oldest traditions in a world that watches constantly, judging every move. It was a reminder that behind the polished exterior of ceremonial events, behind the rehearsed smiles and perfectly timed appearances, there exist deeply human choices, decisions made out of care, compassion, and the instinct to protect those most vulnerable. Beyond the immediate concern for Louis, there was a larger context, one that reached back through generations of monarchy and tradition. Queen Elizabeth's interest in philosophical and spiritual reflection was never a secret to those who worked closely with her. She valued history, perspective, and the contemplative consideration of patterns over impulsive decisions. Her conversations, often private, ranged from the symbolic to the practical, the weight of duty, the emotional toll of visibility, the cost exacted by centuries of expectation. According to multiple biographers, she sometimes invited advisors to discuss the emotional dimensions of monarchy, how symbols, appearances, and rituals could influence the lives of those who lived within their framework. These were not conversations about predictions, nor were they instructions for action. They were reflections, a way to understand the forces at play in a life defined by inheritance and expectation. One recollection, recorded years later by a retired lady-in-waiting, captures a private conversation between Elizabeth and Catherine during Catherine's early years in the royal family. It was not a warning nor a prophecy. It was an observation, a quiet, almost philosophical note on the nature of duty and visibility. Elizabeth remarked that responsibility is never distributed evenly, that in a family shaped by ceremony, public scrutiny, and historical precedent, the child least prepared is often the one most affected. At the time, Catherine likely received this as abstract wisdom, an idea too theoretical to act upon immediately. But with hindsight, the weight of those words becomes undeniable. They were a subtle instruction, a reminder that the youngest, the most overlooked, the one expected to adapt without complaint, often bears the heaviest unseen burdens. This understanding provides a lens through which to view Louis's absence. It was not merely a practical decision or a parental instinct. It was an acknowledgement that some traditions exact too high a price, that the crown, while resting physically upon heads, exerts pressures far deeper than outward appearances suggest. And while the public saw absence, no waves, no appearances, no smiles, behind palace walls, a far more significant recalibration was unfolding. The monarchy, like any institution, must balance expectation with humanity, legacy with life, visibility with care. In this case, the balance tilted decisively toward the latter. For Catherine and William, that balance required action at every level. Every decision, from minor adjustments to daily routines to the management of press and photographers, became a negotiation between care and duty. Specialists were consulted in private, their guidance weighed and debated. Restrictions on photography, the careful orchestration of appearances, and the slowing of schedules were all deliberate acts designed to safeguard Louis without creating unnecessary attention. Even the brief, almost imperceptible gestures, Catherine's glance, William's nod, were amplified in meaning by the choices made behind closed doors. They were signals to each other, to aides, and to those responsible for the child's environment. Observe, protect, shield, and prioritize humanity above all. History echoes in these choices. Across generations, the youngest members of royal families have often been quietly shielded from excessive visibility, their protection treated as both an obligation and a challenge. The stories are rarely publicized, often unnoticed until patterns emerge in retrospect. Louis's absence fits into this continuum, a quiet act born of insight, experience, and a refusal to repeat mistakes. It is both a reflection of parental instinct and a subtle acknowledgment of history, that tradition, while revered, is not above care, and that the pressures of visibility can be profoundly damaging if left unchecked. In this light, Louis's disappearance is not simply an anomaly or a momentary pause. It is a statement about the evolving understanding of duty, childhood, and responsibility in the modern monarchy. It reveals a family willing to prioritize well-being over optics, substance over spectacle, and humanity over the relentless gaze of history and media. The choices made behind closed doors are invisible to most, yet they define the institution as much as the rituals and appearances that the public sees. And as the palace navigates this delicate balance, one truth becomes unavoidable. The crown does not rest lightly, and it does not rest equally. Sometimes those who are least equipped to bear it are the ones most impacted. In Louis's absence, the monarchy quietly confronts that reality, reshaping tradition in ways both subtle and profound, challenging assumptions about duty, visibility, and the limits of public expectation. The decisions made now, deliberate, cautious, protective, may very well define the family and perhaps the monarchy itself for a generation. Information began surfacing slowly in whispers that seemed almost inconsequential at first. A line here, a hint there, fragments of stories that suggested something was amiss. Tabloid speculation, perhaps, but the timing, the context, the consistency of the whispers all raised eyebrows within royal circles. What was meant to remain private had begun to leak, and with every fragment, trust quietly eroded. Control, the carefully maintained precision that defined the monarchy, had slipped, and in an institution built on exacting rules and symbolic clarity, that loss was deeply unsettling. In response, William and Catherine began to operate independently, not in rebellion, not out of defiance, but out of protection. Every move, every decision, every carefully orchestrated action was filtered through the lens of care. They became guardians of both their child and the integrity of his development, mindful that the world could never fully understand the stakes. Amid the swirling speculation, one voice quietly gained significance, a caregiver who had spent years observing Louis during his earliest formative moments. She spoke not of drama, not of scandal, but of humanity. She emphasized the child's sensitivity, moments of being overwhelmed by attention, discomfort with rigid routines, times when quiet mattered far more than ceremony or spectacle. In those observations lay a truth often lost in headlines. The needs of a child, even one born into royalty, can outweigh the expectations of the world. Then came the official clarification. 6 lines, carefully worded, delivered with the precision only the palace could command. Louis would take a temporary pause from public appearances, allowing him space to grow, to develop emotionally, and to simply be a child. There was no scandal, no sensationalism, no insinuation, only protection, deliberate and uncompromising. Reactions were immediate and sharply divided. Some applauded the decision, recognizing it as compassionate, overdue, and humane. Others demanded transparency, frustrated by the lack of details and the silence that seemed almost impenetrable. And yet William and Catherine did not respond. Their silence was absolute, deliberate, and final. For a couple once defined by openness, that quiet itself spoke volumes. This was a decision made, and it was not open to debate. But this story is not merely about absence. It is about boundaries, the invisible lines that define what is protected, what is exposed, and what is sacred. It is about the heavy price that tradition can demand, and the decisive moment when protection must outweigh performance, humanity must outweigh optics, and a child's well-being must outweigh the relentless expectations of a centuries-old institution. Even Queen Elizabeth understood this. Her philosophical reflections, private conversations with advisors, and meditations on symbolism and tradition all underscored a singular truth. In a family defined by duty, the youngest, often overlooked, bears the heaviest unseen burden. Visibility is not evenly distributed, and the pressures of expectation weigh most heavily on those least prepared to carry them. So why was Louis absent? Was it crisis management, parental compassion, or a quiet acknowledgement that some traditions demand too high a price, that certain expectations are too great for a child to bear without consequence? The crown does not rest solely upon the heads of its heirs. It presses, sometimes invisibly, on shoulders never meant to carry it. And as the monarchy moves forward in silence, carefully calibrating what is seen and unseen, one truth becomes unavoidable. Sometimes the most profound and powerful decision a family can make is the one that is never announced. It is the choice made not for the world, not for headlines, but for the life, growth, and well-being of a single child. And in that quiet, deliberate act, the monarchy itself is reminded that humanity must always come first, even when history, expectation, and tradition demand otherwise.